So I'll just say again, how great it is to have Alison here. I mean, it's a real privilege. I've known Alison for many years, and over those many years, I've got to know her work really well and admired it and used it extensively, both in my research and in my teaching. And Alison's currently Professor of Sociology at Newcastle University, having previously worked at Sussex. I mean, there's so much I could say about your work, Alison, but I'll just kind of flag your two most recent books, which are Me, Not You, The Trouble with Mainstream Feminism, published in 2020, and The Politics of the Body, published in 2014. And known for so many different aspects of work, but I suppose especially well known, certainly the work I know best is your work on sexual violence in higher education, which has been so influential on the field. So I also just want to say, aside from being an excellent researcher and activist, that Alison's such a generous scholar and shares a lot of her really valuable teaching resources online. So I'd encourage you to check out Alison's website to look at some of those, because they're so helpful. And as I say, you're really generous, Alison. So there's much more I could say, but I won't. I'll hand over to you for the seminar today, which is called Neo-feudalism, Platform Capitalism, and the Re-enclosure of Women. So thank you, and over to you, Alison.
Oh, thank you so much, Carolyn. This is weird because I've got Gareth here who taught me as an undergraduate, and I met you, Carolyn, I think when I was a PhD, a very green PhD student, and you were already a rising star of gender and education, and I was so in awe of you. So it's kind of it's amazing to be here and to have you introduce me like that, and I feel quite nervous now. I have one slide which I think Philip is going to share on the screen. Thank you. So I'm going to start with Jeremy Clarkson again, and the column that he wrote in The Sun in 2022 about Meghan Markle. And I'll just repeat the quote again. "I despise her on a cellular level and dream of the day she will be made to parade naked through Britain while the crowd throws excrement and chants shame at her." Which was a reference to Cersei's Walk of Atonement from Game of Thrones. And that scene was apparently based on the actual case of Edward IV's mistress, Jane Shore. So Shore was accused of witchcraft after the king's death and endured a similar penance walk through London in 1483. Clarkson's comments about Markle caused widespread outrage. So I don't know how many of you have watched Game of Thrones, but it's a truly horrific scene. And I wouldn't have shown it in this talk. I wouldn't have been able to show it without a serious content warning, but I don't think I would have shown it anyway. Even Piers Morgan, who's had his own weird obsession with Markle since 2016, said he thought a line had been crossed, although he immediately undermined any claims to decency by asking the opinion of Andrew Tate, who's clearly the right person to say whether something's sexist or not. Tate said he didn't think that Clarkson should have apologised. So for about $6.5 grand, any men on this call could become part of Andrew Tate's War Room, which is an elite global network advertised as a place where men can free themselves from socially induced incarceration. And they seem to do this mainly by manipulating women and dominating women. The most successful ones manipulate their girlfriends into sex work from which the men profit. The War Room is run by self-proclaimed wizard Iggy Semmelweis, who said, channeling Conan the Barbarian, that this is the life all men should dream of, the life of a Cimmerian conqueror. Men who fail to achieve the life of a Cimmerian conqueror sometimes call themselves incels or involuntary celibates. And one of these, 22-year-old Elliot Rodger, killed 6 people and wounded 14 others in California in 2014 after writing a manifesto called The War on Women. In his final video, he said, "If I can't have you, girls, I will destroy you." In 2018, Rodger was the inspiration for fellow incel Alec Minassian, who killed 10 pedestrians in Toronto with a van. In 2019, Connor Betts shot and killed 9 people in Ohio. He allegedly had a hit list and a rape list. This is a collection of very horrible things. I did warn you, and I did say to Carolyn that the last time I did this talk, we had wine, which seemed to help. So feel free to go and get yourself a glass of wine or a whiskey if you need it. So usually we examine cases like this through a misogyny or a cultural backlash frame. And what I want to do today is explore what else is at play, so specifically to think about how we might sketch a political economy of this violence to understand more deeply what it is and what it does. The talk is drawn from my forthcoming book, which is called Personal Business, Sexual Violence in Racial Capitalism, and it's with Manchester University Press. And the book analyses what sexual violence does in broader systems of domination, articulating patriarchy and racial capitalism as not just intersecting, but as mutually interdependent. The book also explores all the different ways that sexual violence enters the world, acts and threats of violence, and imputations and punishment of violence, and argues that all of these vectors of sexual violence co-act in systems of control. It has 4 key themes: enclosure, extraction, dispossession, and disposal. And this talk is from the last chapter of the book. If you look on the slide, the chapters are listed, and this talk is the last one, exploring digital violence in late capitalist economies that have sometimes been called neo-feudal. This is a work in progress, so I'm really looking forward to what you think of it and to discussing it in more detail. So hopefully I won't talk for too long and we can have a good chat afterwards. So first, I want to set some context. If we understand the present as late capitalist, we could call it platform capitalism, communicative capitalism, techno-capitalism, or cloud capital. These are all words that have been used to describe it. It was built out of the rubble of crisis, the 1970s breakdown in manufacturing, and the 2008 financial collapse. Capital remade itself from the debris of the digital infrastructure of the 1990s dot-com boom and the cash injection into tech companies because of post-2008 quantitative easing. And we've now, as you know, seen a widespread turn to data to maintain economic growth. So the platform is the central structure here, and it brings together customers, advertisers, producers, and suppliers as it extracts and processes data. It creates what's been called network effects. So the more users a platform has, the more data it can gather, the more valuable it becomes, the more users it attracts, and so on. And this produces what's been called data colonialism. So there's a drive to find and extract more and more. The main frontier here is an intimate one. So our personal data is the raw material that's extracted, analysed, repackaged, used, and sold. The platform has been called a surveillance-dependent monopoly form. So we give it access to our email, our calendars, our search results, our locations, and its services are continuously honed through that surveillance. We're also tied to particular platforms through our devices. We become dependent on their apps, and we find it difficult to retrieve and transport our own data. This digital enclosure culminates in the one-stop shop represented by platforms such as Facebook and Weibo, on which news, socializing, and consumption all take place. Brett Christophers sees the platform as the dominant asset form in a broader formation called rentier capitalism, in which success is based on control of assets rather than ownership of the means of production. So other assets include telephone and energy infrastructures, real estates, and patents. And monopoly over these facilitates price increases and wage squeezes, which explains how, as rentier capital grows, income and wealth inequality also grow. This is a model based on conquest and destruction rather than competition and efficiency, which means that revenue isn't reinvested but hoarded instead. So in effect, success in rentier capitalism means taking up space and making money without having to do anything at all. And because of this, some have argued that we're no longer living in a capitalist system, but one that's more akin to the feudal age. The contemporary ruling class don't own the means of production, and rent and debt are now more central to extraction than surplus value and profit. Jodie Dean calls this neo-feudalism, and it also involves what she calls a reparcelization of sovereignty. So the largest corporations are now more valuable than most national economies, and governments relate to them as if they were sovereign states. There's a multitude of new kingdoms, many of them based in the cloud. Benjamin Bratton has called this new arrangement the stack, as in the title of my chapter. He calls it an accidental megastructure created by planetary scale computation, which is equivalent to states and markets, but reducible to neither. And this creates social relations more like those between feudal lords and serfs than between capitalists and the proletariat. So the lords of neo-feudalism are platform billionaires, and the serfs are the rest of us. We need the platform for both consumption, of which it takes a cut, and production, of which it takes a cut. We also work for it for free under the masquerade of participation. Yanis Varoufakis calls this techno-feudalism, and he argues that a space such as Amazon isn't a market, but a cloud fief in which vendors or vassals rent space. Platforms such as Uber and Airbnb reconfigure personal items such as homes and cars as instruments of capital accumulation, most of which again goes to the platform. Nancy Fraser would understand this as a merger of exploitation and expropriation. So expropriation, she argues, is no longer confined to the periphery and to marginalized people in the core, but also applies to people who were previously shielded by their status as citizen workers in the imperial core. Expropriation occurs through low-wage precarious service work, debt and fines, bank fees, price hikes on water and other utilities, increased private property rents and evictions, and the mining and sale of our data. Workers who were previously merely exploited are now also expropriated, a double condition which is compounded by the ongoing assault on the welfare state. So while neo-feudal lords are protected by the legal system and often hoard their wealth offshore to escape taxes, serfs are immiserated. And this has also produced what Jodie Dean terms a loss of a general capacity to reproduce the basic conditions of a livable life. And this is for most of us. So what Fraser calls the long spell of corporate binging, known as neoliberalism, forced state disinvestment from social welfare while recruiting middle-class women into the paid workforce. The new norm of the dual earner family is expected to maintain itself with little to no state involvement. Social reproduction is commodified for those who can afford it, provided along transnational care chains, at the bottom of which there's almost no care capacity left. And the number of people who can afford to be at the top of these chains is also shrinking fast, due to what Dean calls the tendency to becoming peasant. So there are big questions about how this care crunch or crisis of care will be resolved. As Fraser writes, no society, capitalist or otherwise, that systematically cannibalizes social reproduction can endure for long. This is so depressing, isn't it? I'm really sorry. If you haven't got a whiskey by now, maybe you should go and get one, because I'm about to make it worse. I want to pause here and ask another question that some of you might have been asking yourselves already or silently asking me, which is, what is all this built on? Because, of course, there's a system of even worse expropriation beneath this one. So where, how, and by whom are the natural resources being extracted to fuel planetary scale computation? Where, how, and by whom are our electronic devices being made? How is the natural landscape being eaten up to make the digital one? And these questions are dealt with at length in other parts of the book, in chapters previous to this one, which you can see on the slide. And as well as exploitation and expropriation, there are two more X's I cover in the book. So systems of expulsion from capitalist production, drawing on Gargi Bhattacharya and others, and extermination altogether, drawing on Cedric Robinson and others. So the latter X, of course, is horribly appropriate to the genocide in Gaza, which Naomi Klein has theorized as the uniting of the global political classes behind a shared supremacist vision of safety and security for the few. We can see this vision as a hoarding, not just of safety, but of life itself by the civilized nations at the expense of the Palestinians and of everyone on the outside. So as we theorize neo-feudalism, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that while we might all be becoming peasant, then there remain important differences between us, not least the fact that some of us tend the digital landscape inside what Klein calls the global Iron Dome, while increasing numbers of others have to survive outside of its protection. Theories of neo or techno-feudalism tend to be fairly ungendered, although it's clear to me, and probably also to you as well, that this formation is associated with and asserts particular forms of masculinity. These masculinities are elite and exclusive. As Little and Winch argue, data colonialism accumulates power with a small group of men at the expense even of everyday patriarchs, as even the head of the household loses power to the platform. So the lords of neo-feudalism are a global oligarchy of predominantly white men, financiers, media CEOs, real estate moguls, and carbon billionaires, as well as the owners of cloud capital. They're brought together by a super predatory economic model that's reflected in both their cultural presence and the social relations of their firms. Their personal wealth is immense. According to Oxfam, between 2020 and 2023, the world's super rich accumulated almost twice as much as the bottom 99%. These petty sovereigns are allowed to extract with no return. As I've said already, they hold their wealth offshore to escape taxes, and they force the general public to pay the price through austerity. Tech billionaires are the dominant subset of the neo-feudal aristocracy. Little and Winch have termed them an assemblage involved in a full spectrum struggle for social and political leadership. This assemblage gained strength during COVID-19, which killed almost 7 million people globally and forced many of the rest of us into a closer dependence on cloud capital. So Jeff Bezos of Amazon and Elon Musk of Tesla and SpaceX saw their wealth surge, making them the world's two wealthiest people by a significant margin. And Little and Winch, in their book, The New Patriarchs, analyze the celebrity biographies of these men to explore the new form of hegemonic masculinity, which they call digital capitalism's mode of command. The new corporate form, they write, is less a business with multiple stakeholders and more an extended household run to the whims of its master. The master masculinity merges more modern geek iterations with historical, more aggressive and paternalistic ones that evoke specific imaginaries of the American frontier and the white bourgeois family. Women remain marginal, leaning in to provide support but not ideas, hiding patriarchal power through their visibility and reaping few of the rewards. So for Little and Winch, the main frame of reference for these new macho geeks is the patriarchal white American masculinities of the 17th century colonial era. They compare today's tech billionaires to the robber barons of the Gilded Age. But I think that understanding the economic context in which these men operate as neo-feudal rather than techno-capitalist, or perhaps even as well as techno-capitalist, if we can do that, gives an additional lens on the massive extraction of wealth with no mutuality and the construction of phallic buildings and messianic rockets to save the world. So it seems less like a transition from geek to baron and more to lord or even king to me. I think Little and Winch's framing is perhaps best represented by Jeff Bezos, who's been constructed as a visionary and a pioneer. They argue that he ties his sovereignty at Amazon to a frontier spirit that celebrates the company's harsh cybernetic Taylorism. But their characterization of Musk suggests something different. They cite his superstar virility, which is performed through very public sexual relationships and fathering 11 children, and exploits such as smoking pot while wielding a samurai sword on the Joe Rogan podcast. And while they describe Mark Zuckerberg as a more gentle post-feminist patriarchy, I actually think he's also a sword guy. And he's recently gone full warrior, last seen hunting wild boar with a bow and arrow. This year saw the publication of Burn Book, which is a really good read, and in which tech journalist Kara Swisher gives her account of the industry and her interactions with all of these men. And although she doesn't say explicitly, her account positions the tech titans less as colonial patriarchs and more as feudal kings. So they seem to uphold their own divine right to rule, seeing themselves not as self-made men, but as born into their power by virtue of their superior intelligence and ideas. Like kings, they've also been handed their wealth, from an internet originally funded through taxpayer dollars to the massive cash injection into tech through quantitative easing. They hold court with what she calls legions of enablers, to the extent that fawning becomes the reality, making valid questions seem like personal attacks. So Swisher recounts how, when platform billionaires started to get pushback about the damage their products were causing, victimhood wasn't ever present in motion that would flare across the entire tech brotherhood. The petulance she describes calls to mind both the childlike nature of the tech industry with its bouncy balls, scooters, and skateboards, and the demeanor of a feudal despot. As the tech industry grew, she writes, the preternaturally large 3-year-olds that ran it went from childlike to childish and got even more dangerous. Musk especially developed the thinnest of skins and grew increasingly unhinged. Little and Winch call Musk a wounded genius, which links to earlier and openly misogynistic toxic geek masculinities expressed in phenomena such as Gamergate. So the stack is a place where some of these toxic geeks now have their own kingdoms, while continuing to feel like the world doesn't treat them as they deserve. If the economic and social life of neo-feudalism is structured by theft, predation, and domination, its cultural life may be shaped by the whims and tantrums of its boy kings. And of course, the right to extract without return, the enlargement of one's space and wealth at the expense of others, and the elevation of a few individuals to king or godlike status is also highly conducive to sexual violence. Techno-feudalism's kingdoms are places where misogyny and abuse is rife. In 2018, Google staff staged a global walkout over sexual harassment. Bezos's space company Blue Origin was described as rife with sexism in an open letter by current and ex-staffers, which also claimed that numerous senior leaders had been known to be consistently inappropriate with women. In 2022, a group of SpaceX employees released a statement denouncing the frattish persona of Elon Musk, and sexual harassment cases were brought by 7 women working at Tesla. In Rolling Stone, one complainant was reported as saying, there are people in that factory who see Elon Musk as a god. If he talks like that, they know they can too. Swisher also writes that Musk pretty much considers himself a deity. And these threads of immense wealth, divine authority, sexual entitlement, and petulance at perceived oppression also bind tech billionaires culturally to Donald Trump, who's a blend of neo-feudal lord and old-school tycoon, and who's also deeply materially intertwined with tech billionaires through links brokered by Peter Thiel. Trump himself, as you know, has been credibly accused of rape, sexual assault, and sexual harassment by at least 25 women since the 1970s. He's also been able to turn these allegations into a story of his own mistreatment. As Bosdorf writes, his combination of appealing to sexism and stoking anger during the 2016 presidential elections encouraged men to see themselves as potential victims of false allegations just like him. And the epithet false allegations is actually a misnomer. What's at stake here is the right to abuse with impunity. So the catastrophe for Trump and his supporters is that men might be stripped of their privileges. A false allegation in Trumpian terms is an allegation that a man has done something he's not entitled to do. This is a world in which we are supposed to understand men like Trump and Musk are entitled to everything. Reporting on the Tesla cases, Stephen Roderick wrote in Rolling Stone that the 7 women had alleged a level of sexual harassment that painted the company as more like one of William Blake's dark satanic mills than a high-flying Silicon Valley corporation saving the environment. but the extent and nature of the sexual aggression that he describes could be less fitting to the industrial age than a neo-feudal fantasy of utter feminine submission. One of the Tesla employees recounted hearing a male colleague boast, "I like to spit on a girl's face when I'm fucking her." This type of sexualized woman-hating is fundamental to the contemporary aggrieved white masculinities that peak in Trump and his supporters. And Trump's key rhetorical achievement has been to oscillate between conqueror and victim and encourage his followers to do the same. For Kelly, this allows Trump and his audiences to disavow hegemonic whiteness and align themselves with a marginalized, politically exiled subjectivity. Trump's petulant king demagoguery is tied to both performances of sexual entitlement and the re-articulation of sexual assault allegations as violence. So this can be seen as a form of sexualized resentiment that allows Trump and his allies to reconcile their privileges and victories with their claims of oppression. Resentiment, as you know, differs from resentment. As Kelly argues, it's a combination of righteous anger expressed alongside a feeling of inability to express or act on that anger. So this anger can't ever be fully sated, creating a nearly inexhaustible rhetorical resource which justifies cruelty against an ever-growing list of enemies. Anger constantly circulates, brutality becomes its own reward, and Trump and his men are united in their enjoyment of others' suffering, which is sexualized more often than not. This, then, is a looking-glass world in which a petty sovereign can pretend to be a serf. Trump provides a direct link with the resurgent backlash against feminism and other social justice movements. And while men like him are its icons, the neo-feudal conditions they've created produce its economic base. Backlash politics combines the angry entitlement of those who've lost privileges or are struggling more than they expected to, with a protest vote by the impoverished and downwardly mobile masses of the rentier economy, or at least some of them. But unlike the feudal peasantry, today's impoverished masses have been whipped up against the establishment by politicians and oligarchs who are the establishment themselves. And the stack is a key site for this backlash politics. The kingdoms of cloud capital are realms where violence is normalized or even encouraged under the banner of freedom of speech. Algorithms and advertising are the two pillars of violence. So the former is designed to keep users engaged, to raise the value of digital real estate to sell for the latter. In order to maximize traffic, platforms maximize the stickiness of interactions, which is often done through facilitating trolling and flame wars. This produces a bias towards inflammatory content that's often right-wing. Much digital violence is associated with the expansion of anti-feminist militancy into the cloud. The early 2000s saw the growth of the manosphere, an assemblage of networked groups of anti-feminists, men's and fathers' rights activists, evangelical Christians, and paleo-masculinists. Its various nodes are connected by the belief that men and boys are the real victims. And this is embodied in red pill philosophy, which you've probably heard of, which draws on the film The Matrix to describe men's awakening to the truth of feminism's evil agenda and biological gender difference. The manosphere crosses borders of culture and nation, facilitated by transnational funding streams for anti-gender movements. There's evidence of significant digital anti-feminist activity in the UK, the US, Pakistan, India, Kenya, Poland, Australia, the Philippines, Colombia, the DRC, Mexico, Chile, Hungary, Spain, Brazil, Germany, Russia. You get the picture. In some of these places, to frame it as a grassroots backlash against feminism is incorrect. So in India, Brazil, and elsewhere, anti-gender militancy is or largely has been driven by the state. Misogyny commutes back and forth from the manosphere into society, politics, and institutions, manifested in attacks on reproductive rights and widespread gender-based violence. According to Sarah Bannett-Weiser, 70% of digital harassment is targeted at women, women of colour in particular. Most of it's sexual, ranging from comments to threats of sexual violence to the sharing of explicit content. Technology has also created new forms of violence, such as doxing, revenge porn, and deepfake porn. If you haven't heard of deepfake porn, it emerged in 2017 on Reddit when an anonymous user uploaded clips mapping faces of celebrities onto the bodies of actresses in pornography. Within a month, tens of thousands of other users had followed suit, and although there are deepfakes of many forms, the majority of them continue to be pornographic. In 2018, BJP supporters targeted Indian investigative journalist Rana Ayub with a deepfake after she spoke out against the rape of an 88-year-old Kashmiri girl. Her face was edited into a porn video, which, in her words, ended up on every phone in the country. The next day, her name and phone number were shared and she was inundated with abuse. She said, "I just couldn't see through the humiliation. People were thinking they could now do whatever they wanted to me." She also said that following the experience, she was starting to self-censor. So digital harassment has been seen as quintessentially techno-capitalist and neoliberal. I think it can also be read as neo-feudal. It evokes a new cyborgian dark ages of violent communitarianism without shared values or accountability, in which the only form of regulation is a steady carceral creep from the offline space. Feudal imaginaries are perhaps most apparent in the widespread shaming of women, a centuries-old regulatory practice that thrives online due to the affordances of the cloud. Bennett-Weiser theorizes such shaming as a product of economies of visibility and the constitutive flip side of the neoliberal focus on self-esteem. But I think there's also a feudal spectacle in its occurrence in the networked public square. At the extremes, this online violence has crossed into the offline space through men literally taking up arms. This is most associated with incels, who are a child node of seduction communities or pickup artists who pay for training to help them attract women. Pickup artist training combines the gender essentialism of evolutionary psychology, so men's need to dominate and women's to be dominated, with neoliberal rationalities such as investment, returns, and market value. The incel developed from some men's sense of failure in not being able to be pickup artists. Incels rationalize this through feudal-sounding hierarchies of alpha and beta masculinities. They resentfully align themselves with the betas and feel relationships and sex are a birthright they're being denied. Breach and Bennett-Weiser contend that incels have emerged from the ashes of the neoliberal entrepreneurializing subject who's epitomized by the pickup artist. So they say that incels deviate from the neoliberal script in refusing to internalize their failures as their own responsibility and instead projecting them outwards in the form of sometimes murderous rage. The incels' refusal of the neoliberal bargain is embodied in the shift from red pill to black pill philosophy, which finds life to be an eternal sentence, a curse, a destiny, in which there's also no responsibility for one's lot. But the rageful resignation of the shift from pickup artist to incel, so from competitive individualism to mass violence, can also be seen as a form of sexualized resentiment that fits with a neo-feudal framework. So I think the incel can be seen as a serf who's enraged he can't be a lord, but who's also resigned to his lowly fate. This cyborgian serfdom, which transforms its sufferance into a seething hatred of women, seems bound to turn to violence either through imaginary pitchforks or real guns. And as Breach and Bennett-Weiser write, incels' aggrieved entitlements aren't a craving for the bourgeois nuclear family or even for the more plastic relationships of neoliberalism. They're about building status and ego, conquering women and keeping them under control. This focus on ownership and conquest is neo-feudal and frames the channeling of incel rage into acts of what Brecht and Bannock-Weiser call honour terrorism, seemingly indiscriminate violence that evokes a medieval-style massacre. The broadcasting of such acts online completes the grisly spectacle as they brag about the bloodshed in the digital town square. So the incel can be seen as an extreme example of the sexualized resentiment that animates the whole manosphere. The contemporary misogyny militia understand themselves as serfs and express a frustrated desire for the kingships and lordships held by the richest few. And it's this frustrated desire for power, rather than attempts to gain power itself, that produces violence and cruelty for its own sake. The blood sport of online shaming, which is literally about the pleasure of watching others suffer, brings to mind the crowds at medieval executions and around the pillory, as well as contemporary neo-feudal fantasies such as Game of Thrones. In contrast to these serfs, manfluencer Andrew Tate can be seen as the ultimate pickup artist success. His online persona is of an apex predator who amasses subordinate predators in his wake. His fiefdom combines the elite war room with dominion as a petty sovereign over teenage boys. Tate could be seen as the quintessential neoliberal subject, but he also directly evokes a fantasy of lordship, with frequent discussion of weapons and statements about literally owning women as property and branding them with tattoos of his name. A BBC investigation of leaked chat logs from the war room identified 45 women who were allegedly coerced into sex work by its members. In 2022, Tate, his brother, and 2 associates were indicted in Romania on charges of rape, human trafficking, and organised crime. Tate has also been accused of rape and sexual assault by 4 women in the UK. His defenders have included Elon Musk and Donald Trump. So the question I've been building up to, which I don't have the answer to, obviously, but I have some thoughts on, is what is going on with all of this? And as I said at the beginning, most interpretations of the manosphere sit within a cultural backlash framework that treats changes in capitalist formations as little more than background. And while popular misogyny is a cultural reaction to popular feminism, it's also more than that. So in this last part of the talk, I'm going to be building on the work of Eugenia Ciapera, who relates online misogyny to Federici's account of the early modern witch hunts that facilitated the transition from feudalism to capitalism. The witch hunts destroyed the power of women and brought them under male control in order to create the separation of public and private spheres, the bourgeois nuclear family, and the free social reproduction that underpins capitalist production. So Ciapera argues that as we move into a techno-capitalist era, we're seeing another attempt to restructure society by excluding women from technological spaces. She notes the intense attacks on prominent women in politics, technology, and other public roles, which aim to silence these women and the other women who bear witness to them. This is coupled with attempts to restate or reinstate traditional gender, ranging from online memes to offline pro-family fascism and attacks on reproductive rights. Ciapera contextualizes this within widespread precarity, lack of social welfare, and increasing debt that create anxiety and competition in a way not dissimilar to the early modern period. So Ciapera's account defines the underlying economic formation as neoliberal techno-capitalism. She argues that online misogyny and offline anti-feminism both aim to exclude women from full participation in technology, in other words, from accessing and controlling the means of production. And in some ways, the backlash against feminism is quintessentially neoliberal. It's rooted in a competitive worldview that positions men's and women's achievements as a zero-sum game. It plays directly into the hands of the racial capitalist divide and rule that was facilitated by the early modern enclosure of women. But if we understand the present as techno or neo-feudal rather than neoliberal and techno-capitalist, this perhaps changes our understanding slightly. So in neo or techno-feudalism, we all own the means of production, which are our devices. What we don't own is the digital real estate, which is the property of a privileged few, most of whom are white men. The vast majority of us, of all genders, are serfs. The kings of cloud capital want to keep us all dependent on our devices so they can extract our data, which is the raw material. Keeping us hooked requires intense, unpleasant interactions, and digital violence against women is particularly profitable in this regard. But data colonialism isn't about excluding women from technological spaces. It's about keeping as many of us as possible hooked for as long as possible. So excluding women from technology might be a side effect of what's going on, but it's not the main project, and it might even be incompatible with the main project. And if most of us are serfs, then the manosphere is a digital fief for lords such as Andrew Tate and Donald Trump. We could understand digital violence as both aping these master masculinities and as a power grab by men who are downwardly mobile and want to claim territory for themselves. But the concept of resentiment also suggests that a lot of digital violence is about cruelty for its own sake, born out of a frustrated desire for power rather than an attempt to gain power itself. This also requires a constant supply of victims in the techno-feudal fief. If the women disappeared, then these men would have nothing to do. On a structural level, we know that in capitalism, the bourgeois family is the key site for extracting social reproduction. The current crisis of social reproduction is associated with its replacement with a new norm of the two-earner family, as well as massive state disinvestment in welfare. So if we are transitioning into a new form of feudalism, this is a form without the ability to subsist that historical peasants had. And this will certainly produce boundary struggles over gender, as Nancy Fraser says. But re-establishing the bourgeois nuclear family, as the far right clearly wants to do, doesn't seem to be quite what underpins violence in the cloud. The kings of cloud capital aren't primarily concerned about the division of labour between production and reproduction. They want to extract data from all of us alike. And the angry serfs don't want women to have families with, to breed workers for techno-capitalism. They want women to enslave or to throw excrement at as they stumble naked through the streets. So this suggests to me that we need a bit more than see Apira's account, which is about misogyny resurfacing in techno-capitalism as part of struggles over a new division of labour. If we see the current conjuncture as techno-feudal, this division of labour is to a certain extent flattened out. We're all techno-serfs. The important division then perhaps is between who gives out the abuse and who's expected to take it in these sticky interactions between serfs that generate value for the platform. And of course, this isn't just to do with gender, it's to do with race, class, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability as well. And this differs from the bargain established in the early modern witch hunts, in which proletarian men were offered power over women to manufacture their consent to capitalism. The main institution of this power was the bourgeois nuclear family, with the husband at the head and the family wage as the material means of controlling women and children. In contrast, the neo-feudal bargain, if we can call it that, doesn't seem to offer men any such material compensation. What they are being offered by the kings of cloud capital is the right to do violence with no consequences, which feeds the algorithm, which increases the value of the digital real estate. And then finally, this neo-feudal bargain also needs to be understood alongside a different covenant, what Naomi Klein calls the poisonous deal all who are relatively fortunate on this partitioned planet are being offered. Take the gun, she writes, accept the cages, fortress your escape pod and your borders, perfect your kids, protect your brand, ignore the shadowlands, play the victim. So much of the violence that proliferates online is perpetrated by people who live within the global Iron Dome, not in the edge spaces of capitalism, not in the post-colonial wasteland that Bhattacharya and others have described. So we need to understand more fully how this digital violence and the bargain that authorises that, the one that feeds neo-feudal expropriation, also interacts with the even more malignant deal that Klein describes, and the other two X's I've mentioned, expulsion and extermination. So if gender is being redefined in the transition to neo-feudalism, it may be in ways quite different to what was required for the transition to capitalism. And we're also not returning to feudalism economically, socially, or culturally. The economic relations are very different. And it's also worth saying that feudal women weren't completely powerless, or they wouldn't have had to be so violently enclosed. So we're re-articulating feudal relations for the era of cloud capital. And part of this seems to be neo-feudal fantasies of restored masculine power and entitlement that have a number of different functions. I don't think we fully understand how all of this fits together yet. So I want to end with a couple of questions for you, which are at the bottom of the slide, and are: how can we understand neo-feudal gender and the purposes it serves? And importantly, how could we work towards gender and sexual liberation in neo-feudal times? And I think I'll stop there so you can tell me the answers. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much, Alison. I mean, there was so much there. Absolutely fascinating, and my head's spinning with it all. I think it's just created so many questions and so many thoughts, and really, really interesting stuff. So thank you so much.
You need a whiskey, Carolyn.
I do. I mean, you did say it was going to be depressing, and
I know, I did warn you.
it was.
Sorry.
But also fascinating in equal measure. So so plenty of time then for questions and comments and answers to Alison's questions as well. So please do, if you can, if you're able to, kind of turn your cameras on and ask questions. But if you don't want to do that, then also put them in the chat.
I'm glad my Zoom held up. It was all right, wasn't it? There was no freezing.
No, there wasn't. No, it was great.
Very good.
Yeah. Okay. So there's some comments in the chat about how wonderful it was, and that you've asked us some big questions.
Yeah, sorry. Tell me the answers. I need to know. Sally's asked about the Nancy Fraser references, which are her new book called Cannibal Capitalism, which is really good. And also her previous stuff on social reproduction, particularly I think there was an article in New Left Review that was really useful, that I've used. So yeah, I'd recommend that. And also, I mean, Gargi Bhattacharya's book, Rethinking Racial Capitalism, is just wonderful. And I've drawn a lot from that, as you can probably tell.
Thank you. Question there
Carmen.
from Carmen. Hey, good to see you, Carmen.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, right?
Sure.
Kind of. Yeah, you're a bit muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Just about. Let me put my other headphone in. Go on.
Oh, sorry about that.
It's okay.
Thank you, Alison, for this thought-provoking presentation. It has been wonderful to see your analysis and how you present in terms of violence and digital violence. So my question is something that we question within decolonial lines about the binary. So I was just wondering, to which extent your analysis can be a bit stuck in that binary of bad. And in your final question about how do we work towards liberation, whether we need to see the third space, the in-between, and also the operation of the violence, not only structurally, but also in agentic terms. So I think that will help to see the possibilities that are in between. Yeah, so not sure if I making sense.
Yeah, no, you are. Thank you. When you were talking about the binary, I missed part of it. Do you mean stuck in a gender binary or stuck in other kinds of binaries as well?
Any kind of binary. So
yeah,
because from decolonial literature, we understand that this binary is also coming from the Enlightenment period.
Yeah.
And we kind of reproduce it.
Mm.
So what they say is that the coloniality needs to happen in the in-between spaces.
Yeah.
We do not classify one as A and the other as B, but rather
Yes.
how A and B are constructing each other.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's probably right. And I think theorizing, I mean, you probably find this as well, Carolyn, in some ways, theorizing sexual violence is often really difficult because a lot of the theory that we have to draw on is so stuck in the gender binary, and also other binaries such as between perpetrator and victim, as well. So I think probably it is a bit stuck. And I think that when I said at the end that the kind of the violence in online spaces is not just about kind of that gender binary, that's probably where it needs to be developed still more. But also, I think probably when I articulate this chapter with other chapters of the book a bit more, it might shift. So I've got a chapter early on the coloniality of sexual violence, which draws quite heavily on, Maria Lugones and other authors to argue that the particular form of sexual violence that we see now has its roots in a lot of those colonial binaries, not just between male and female, but between white and black, and other things. So I think that maybe when I kind of bring the book together and start articulating this with those other chapters, it will shift, and maybe some of that will become a bit less binary. Does that make sense? And in terms of the sort of the agentic side, yeah, I mean, I always find it difficult when people say, so what should we do? Because I often then you can kind of come up with very vague sort of notions around agency, but nothing too specific. And I had a really interesting discussion with some colleagues at York St John about, practically what do we do about this? Do we chuck our phones in the river? I mean, obviously not. I think Yanis Varoufakis is really good on this, actually. If you've not read his book on techno-feudalism, or if you watch him speak, he says, I love my Amazon Alexa, it's a key part of my life, but I also realize that it's problematic in all these ways. So how can we and we can't get rid of this technology. We're deeply intertwined with it now, aren't we? So, maybe that is about the in-between spaces, and finding those spaces in the technological infrastructure, much as we would do in an institutional infrastructure or in a legal structure. Yeah, it's funny, Molly's on the call as well. We had this conversation yesterday with a colleague about kind of human rights and decoloniality, and is there any way that you can use human rights discourse in a more strategic way, in a more decolonial way? It's really hard. Oh, Molly, I thought that was a question from Molly, but it's not.
I think it kind of is. I mean, I don't know whether you want to kind of pick up on the last bit in particular.
Yeah, the stuff around producing more carceral interventions into sexual violence. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say about that. I mean, Molly would have been much better placed to answer that, but I think Molly's already gone. In terms of, the only answer we have to this more regulation, but also how can we trust these corporations to regulate themselves? So where does that leave us, really? I mean, it's a bit like asking the university to protect you, isn't it? Knowing what the university is. Well, it's probably worse, actually, isn't it? Asking Facebook to protect you than asking the university to protect you. So yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know whether anybody else has more thoughts on that, on kind of ways to tackle online violence. I don't know what. Go on, Carolyn.
No, I was going to say, we'll see whether anybody joins in.
Yeah.
So people, please do feel free to turn your cameras on if you want to at this point.
They're all drunk.
Alison, while we're waiting for more questions, when is your book likely to be out? I'm so keen now to read it.
Oh, well, I'm on research leave this autumn.
Uh-huh.
So I'm hoping to finish it by the end of the year. If my and if this is too much information, I apologize, but if my perimenopause allows. So at the moment I have, like, you know, 1 good week a month where my brain is sort of working. So I'm writing in that time, and I'm doing other bits and pieces during the other times. So keep your fingers crossed for me.
Okay, fantastic. So hopefully towards the beginning of next year.
Hopefully, yeah. So I'm hoping to hand a draft in by the end of this calendar year. Yeah. But it's a big bugger, you know, it's quite ambitious, as you can see from the slide. So it's, you know, I do have questions around kind of when will I feel like it's finished, because obviously I won't get it all right. And obviously it will never feel like I've cracked it. You know, but yeah, hopefully by the end of this calendar year.
Brilliant. But I'm sure a lot of people will be looking forward to it. Jane.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you very much for a presentation that has definitely made my head really spin. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about, because as you said right from the beginning, it's kind of it's difficult stuff to listen to and to have to kind of engage with and really think about. And I suppose I've been thinking recently a lot about, I have a role that predominantly involves teaching undergraduates, and how difficult it is so my sort of instinct is we have to make people really aware. We have to really try and educate and help, particularly young people, kind of understand the world that we inhabit and the world that we live in, as a way to perhaps create opportunities for challenge and change, etc. But how can we share this really difficult stuff with people, particularly I'm thinking with undergraduates, in ways that doesn't kind of traumatize them or keep them safe? I'm kind of lost with that, with the responsibility I feel sometimes in the classroom with that kind of stuff. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, my initial thought is that is a really difficult needle to thread, isn't it? And I thread that with my own kids as well, who are, you know, now, especially my daughter, who's a teenager, who's now kind of using social media and, you know, and seeing some of this stuff. And I do have concerns, and I have had concerns, as Carolyn knows, with the movement around sexual violence in universities, about, you know, not giving the consistent message to female students, especially, of you will be raped. You know, it seems that that is so counterproductive, and not true as well. I do think that one of the main things that we can do is to help young people to kind of negotiate this for themselves. We can't ban it. We can't kind of regulate it out of existence. We have to teach our young people to how to keep themselves safe, but also how to engage with it in a critical way. And I do think that there has been some progress. I mean, my kids certainly seem to be much more savvy about social media than I would expect them to be. But I don't know. That's not a very good answer. Also, I can't see you anymore. Where are you? There you are. Okay.
Yeah, I am still here, and I guess I wasn't. There isn't well, I don't know. But my instinct is there isn't an answer, and it's kind of, in a way, nice to know that people also feel there isn't an answer to some of this stuff. So thank you.
I mean, I try, but the way I deal with it with my kids is very much, you know, not. Sorry, can I just remove that spotlight? Because when I'm just talking to myself, it feels really weird, and I feel like there's nobody here. And then I lose my thread. Yeah, the way I deal with it with my kids is certainly not to kind of scaremonger with them. I don't want them to be afraid, you know, and I don't think there's any point in them being afraid. I think learning how to keep yourself safe is very different from being afraid. So I think I would, you know, I would always go that route. And I also think that there's no need to share all of this stuff either. There's a lot of things that I know the talk was really depressing, but there's a lot of things I could have shared in the talk that I didn't share in the talk deliberately, because I think that can sometimes get a little bit tittillating at times. And I don't think that's helpful either. So I don't know. But then on the other hand, if you don't confront it, then, then how are you supposed to deal with it? And also, if we don't confront our own, I do think Jacqueline Rose has got a point when she says that a lot of violence is produced by our attempts to run away from violence, and that feeds into what Carmen was saying, about the coloniality of violence, in that, some of this horrific violence is the flip side of that enlightenment rationality, which is a suppression of the psyche and all the messiness of and violence of the psyche, and the projection of it into the other. So I don't know. I've talked myself out of that now. I mean, what does it say about me that I like watching Game of Thrones, for example? And I know that a lot of women who work in the sexual violence space, like I knew this woman that was this amazing activist, who loved watching really awful horror movies because it was catharsis, and sometimes watching it means that you're not going to go out and do it. So, I don't know. I mean, I think the conversation is really valuable, isn't it? And figuring it out together. What do we do? And it's probably different in different contexts as well.
Yeah.
And I think teaching young people to sort of trust their instincts is a really good thing to do as well. If it doesn't feel right to you, it probably isn't right. If somebody seems a bit creepy, then they probably are a bit creepy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think the stuff about like thinking about being together with people who you can be kind of comfortable in having some of these difficult conversations. So supporting spaces where people can sort of work out how they're feeling. And I think that feels like a response. That feels like something useful that in a position of being a lecturer, I can kind of, that can be a small contribution, I suppose. So, but yeah, thank you. I mean, thank you very much.
And talking it through. I mean, I think when in schools, when they, when the kids talk about Andrew Tate and the teachers just yell at them, I think, well, why are you doing that? Why aren't you opening up with them, saying, why do you like him? What do you like about him? Do you know what I mean? It's, you can't just yell at them not to engage, because then they'll want to engage even more. So I think as well, sort of creating an environment where everything's on the table, is really important. Yeah, I don't know whether what you think about this, Carolyn, because you've done so much work in this area as well.
I would agree with you. I think it's about having those discussions, however difficult it can be, rather than just trying to ban things and close it down, and trying to kind of educate and work things through, really.
Yeah.
But it's not straightforward, is it?
It's not straightforward at all. No. And some of this stuff is really horrific, and some of the stuff that young people are being exposed to is much more horrific than, perhaps we would have been exposed to when we were kids. Well, that's a very Western problem, of course. Kids in Gaza are being exposed to horrific things as we speak. But I think there's a certain level at which they, that they're kind of in this world, aren't they? That you can't sort of follow them into. There's a question from Richard.
Yeah, Richard, do you want to speak to that, or?
Sorry, I'm just pressing buttons. Yeah, hi, Alison.
Hi.
Thanks for that. Like, massively depressing. Obviously,
I know. I'm sorry.
And no, but of course it's really important. And then there's this sense of powerlessness in a way in the face of it. And coming on to what Jane was talking about, you're wondering kind of what you can do. Right?
Yeah.
And my first kind of thought was, as a parent and the kind of discussions that we have at home, my kids are 11 and 9. And then what you said about teachers. And I'm a school governor at my daughter's primary school. And there are really interesting sets of discussions. So it's not a diverse primary school. And one of the things they asked me, one of the governors said to me, I'm really confused by lots of the social conversations that are happening at the moment. Can you write a kind of glossary of terms that are kind of currently used, or these kinds of things? And so what happened was, of course, in sort of academic mode, I went off and did lots of reading and thinking, but what I had to do was put together what it ended up being like a 4-page guide to the world we live in a way that basically picked up three different intersecting topics: race and empire, gender and sexual orientation, and also disability, and trying to write about them in really kind of accessible ways, but also then showing how we see these things, issues in society, but then also how we see things in education as well, and how this stuff comes up in terms of curriculum and those kinds of things. But is there a sense that lots of people don't know how to talk about these things?
Yeah.
Because we don't talk about these things. And therefore, it's like with, I do a certain amount of decolonizing work, and actually it's really hard to start talking about these things to begin with, because you're worried about stumbling, or you don't know what to say or how to say it.
Yes. Yeah. I think so. That guide sounds brilliant. Yeah, it sounds like such a good thing to
sharing
do.
it with anyone academic. I've never sent it to Carolyn, for example, but there was also some politics involved in that it was kind of edited by the chair of governors, and there were one or two things, or there was one element that I couldn't fight, but I didn't like. But
really?
Yeah. So but yeah, knowing to talk about these things and kind of also having a sense of what's going on, because what you're talking about, we can all see, right?
Yes.
But sort of, let's say, coming at this from a critical theory perspective, it's what's underlying and what's going on that is obvious, but also isn't at the same time.
Yes,
so it's really difficult in some ways to kind of say, well, this is evidently what's going on.
Yeah,
but
no, it
making
is.
it real and dealable with on an everyday basis.
Yeah, no, it is really difficult. And I think with teachers as well, I think they are much more careful now in a lot of ways what they talk about with kids, aren't they? Because they're worried either about parents complaining or about the Daily Mail getting in on the act, So I think it is very, very difficult these days to be a teacher and to tackle some of these more difficult topics. And who knows, if you were to talk about this in more depth in the classroom, maybe some of the parents would complain because they would say, I don't want my kids to know about this. I don't want them talking about this. And I can see how there is a lot of fear around it as well. And also, like you said, Jane, you sort of don't want them to know, but they need to know. It's what do you introduce? At what point do you introduce it? How much do you say? How do you inform without scaring as well? Yeah, but I do think it needs talking about, because these rabbit holes, I mean, this is a completely different topic, but when I was reading around various areas for this paper, I also watched a few documentaries, some on Andrew Tate, some on Elon Musk, which should carry a health warning, but I also watched various ones on kind of just online social media, and the rabbit holes that you can get down so very quickly are quite frightening, and as a parent, you don't know if one of your kids has gone down one of these rabbit holes. And also you're always 2 steps behind the technology. So even if there was regulation, would it work? Because the technology is always 2 steps ahead of you, and the algorithm is always sort of teaching itself, isn't it? So I think the conversations are really, really crucial, and not being afraid of these conversations is really crucial, and not being squeamish about saying some of these things, I guess. Yeah, because sometimes as well, if you don't say it, it seems more scary. If something's mysterious, then it feels even more threatening. In a way. So yeah, I don't know what to do. I need a whiskey.
I'm loving this conversation, because it's just there's a real honesty to it, isn't there? It's like none of us are pretending we've got all the answers.
Yeah, I don't bloody know. Yeah, I mean, I think in academia as well, it's a lot easier to kind of say this is what I think's going on than to say this is what we should do about it. But at the same time, I do think there's a space for a really good kind of description or elucidation of a problem, you know, or a situation or a conjuncture, you know, or a phenomenon, which is what I'm sort of trying to do in the book, you know, and then you can use that as a basis for conversation. And there's no quick fixes, is there? And I think that's the other thing, to kind of resist that pressure for a quick fix, you know, for some kind of policy or governance instrument that will do the work, because it's not like that.
Absolutely. But by the end of December, you might have all the answers.
Oh, I will, I'm sure. Yeah. I will.
We've still got 5 minutes or so for another question or two, or comment, or if anybody else wants to. Oh, Gareth.
Thanks.
Gareth's marking my essay. Oh my God.
Well, I am going to ask a question from a more political theory point of view,
Go on.
or just a comment. So you've got the different analogies to forms of government: colonialism, capitalism, imperialism, feudalism. And I'm wondering how you justify prioritizing feudalism as the appropriate way to conceptualize things, or are you trying to say that somehow elements are crystallizing? This is a Hannah Arendt metaphor, Origins of Totalitarianism. Elements are crystallizing into something that we can't yet fully put our finger on. Is that perhaps the thought?
Yeah, it's the latter, definitely, because I'm not convinced. I think the neo-feudalism, I like Varoufakis's book a lot, and I think the neo-feudalism framework is really helpful. And certainly when I read it, I thought, oh my God, Andrew Tate, which is why I kind of made the connection in this chapter. But I don't think I'm fully sold, and I don't know whether we can we say that there are neo-feudal elements that are kind of coming in to techno-capitalism. I don't know, maybe we can. Probably some sort of dyed-in-the-wool political theorists or political economists would kill me for that, but I do think it's useful, and I'm sort of working with more of a messy conceptualization anyway, because I'm trying to articulate racial capitalism and patriarchy as sort of one system together, but they have different histories. So if you take a kind of temporal lens on it, you can see that patriarchy obviously predates capitalism. So it's kind of like I don't like the sort of organism metaphor, but I haven't quite worked out what it is yet. But it's something that is like, it's almost like a ball that's picking up bits, the rolling ball that's gathering moss or something. It's sort of, these bits are kind of coming into the system. That's how it's working in my head at the moment. So yeah, I don't think I'm saying that we're transitioning from capitalism into neo-feudalism. I'm more saying, what does this lens give us? And I think it does give us something to understand this online violence and misogyny that the neoliberal techno-capital thing doesn't. And not just in terms of the waving of the samurai swords and everything, but also in terms of that relationship to the means of production. If our devices are the means of production, then that does shift the argument. And it's, it can't just be about excluding women from technology. So yeah, I'm not completely sure what I'm saying yet, but I think it's more the latter thing of what you said. Yeah. It'd be nice to chat with you more about that, though, as I sort of build it up together, because it's hard. It's hard to think it all through.
Yes, gladly.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, no, I'll hold you to that. You'll be sorry you said that.
And the one thing you just said that reminded me about the waving the samurai swords. I mean, laughter is such an important weapon here.
Yes.
There's something so ridiculous about this. I was just reading the Guardian feature about Brecht's collages. I don't know if anybody else saw that today, where he's juxtaposing different images of Hitler, for example, but then a small child using the same gestures in a classroom debate, this sort of fake aggression. Have a look at it anyway. But it's also Brecht knew what he was talking about. There's something to laugh at and something to be terrified by at the same time.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really good. I really like that. That's really important. And it is ridiculous. I mean, hunting wild boar with a bow and arrow. I mean, what on earth? What are you doing? So yeah, I do think there is something in laughter and fun, and and I do think actually the most powerful forms of activism I see sometimes today are around that, taking the piss out of stuff. So yeah. Oh, lovely. Thanks for the article.
Okay, my my Zoom just froze there for a second.
Oh, I was wondering, yeah.
Yeah. No, it wasn't me that
very
froze.
quiet.
It was my system. Okay, so there any more final comments or questions, or should we move to thank Alison again? Yeah. Okay, so just before we thank Alison again, I just want to say, I think I'm right in saying, Dee, this is the final EdRes Wednesday seminar for this academic year. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I can't think of a better session on which to end. It's been absolutely fabulous. But also want to thank Phil and Dee and Rebecca for all the work they do organising and making this series run so smoothly. There's a lot of work that goes into it, and I think it's absolutely fantastic. So thanks to you three in particular for all that you do, most of which is behind the scenes. But yeah, I think it's really important work. So thank you, and thanks again to Alison. It's been an absolutely fabulous session, and as I say, really stimulating. I'm sure we're all looking forward to reading your book, and it's just been a great way to end the series for this year. So thanks so much for doing it, Alison, and for your
thanks for having me.
And...
Lovely to see everybody, and thanks for the discussion. It's been really helpful. And Gareth, I'm going to hold you to that. I'm going to send you something if that's all right. Excellent. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks, everybody.